All right, thank you. Thank you for the nice introduction. I didn't understand a word, so I'd like to thank Nina and Georgie and other Georgie and Alexi and the rest of the GDG organization for having me. It's a wonderful opportunity to visit your beautiful country. I'm CTO of a company based out of the Netherlands called Tbilisi, and I wanted to do this session called Being an Android Big Cheese and the Path to Great Success, which is of course a joke. I do see, of course, my company as a great success, but I don't see myself as Android Big Cheese. I wanted to talk about my company, Tbilisi. The idea was basically to do this session to tell you sort of our pathway into getting into Android and kind of how we have seen our agency grow over time, which successes, which challenges we've had, and kind of how we see ourselves in the way forward. But before I talk about the history of Tbilisi, I'd like to tell you how I myself got into mobile. By the way, we're based in this beautiful historical medieval city in the Netherlands called Utrecht. If you ever go to the Netherlands, you definitely have to visit this city. Don't just go to Amsterdam, go to this city as well. It's beautiful. So the way that I got into mobile was actually on Symbian S60. This is the Nokia N95, maybe the original smartphone. Who knows this phone, by the way? Show of hands. Wow, that's a lot of people, my goodness. Who developed for this phone? Nobody. That's awesome. So you could actually develop for this phone in two ways. You had the Java Mobile, J2ME, but you also had Carbide C++. And what I actually did on the platform is I was doing my, my master at the university, and I was doing research how humans interact with these devices under the program called Human-Computer Interaction. And this particular device here you see the N95, and it has these reflectors here. This is the motion capture lab we had at our university, and we investigated basically how users interacted with their phones, basically how they would move their phone around when they were trying to see content or take photographs or that sort of thing. And I ultimately made this application on S60, it's this one here on the right, where we would see a projection of the points of the motion capture data onto the screen. And here we see this is the headwear, this is this unit that's being worn by the subject here. And this blue is basically the projection of the device onto the screen. And it was a really interesting topic to research, but it didn't work very well at all because the problem was really we had to basically cope with the ARM chipset, so very limited chipset. It was a single core processor, it was a very simple camera, and writing code in C++ was very, very challenging. So very quickly, end of 2007, 2008 came around the corner, and there was this wonderful thing that was called Android. And it solved all of the problems that we had with floating point arithmetic on ARM processors in a very generic way, and it was Android 2.0, it was Eclair. I got my first Android device as part of the university with a Motorola Droid, and I got to use this as part of my research. It was basically my first step into actually going into Android, and I instantly fell in love. I was already using Eclipse, Carbide C++ was Eclipse as well, and I was using Java, of course, and it was a great moment to actually step into mobile. And what we were doing at the time, I was working at a company, was in molecular biology, and this was our office at the incubator. I know you guys have incubators here as well, so very similar. We actually started our company in incubator as well, and we were doing software in Java and desktop, and we saw this great opportunity using this project for the Dutch consumer organization to basically create a dynamic map of the cellular reception throughout the Netherlands. So that in the background is the map of the Netherlands, and Utrecht is actually right here. This is where our office is. And you'll see all these green and red points that basically show how the cellular coverage is, whether you have, for instance, data or not. And basically the idea being, say you live here and you work over here somewhere, along the route whether or not you would have a signal. So it was a very insightful application. And it was instantly very technically challenging as well, because we basically had to crowdsource all of this data. As the user would be moving along a freeway or moving in a train, we'd have to, in the background, aggregate all of this data, submit it to an API offline, so synchronizing this data and storing it offline and sending it when the user has connectivity. It was quite challenging. So that was our first project, and we enjoyed it very much. Our company now, we call ourselves no longer an Android an Android app builder or anything like that. We call ourselves a mobile innovation studio. We do things more generically in digital. We do some other platforms as well. We really identified in our company two key resources. We say that we have top-tier technical knowledge, and we also like to say that we have a passion for imagining and building great things. So in that sense, when I go to a client, I like to say, well, we only really like to build something if it's something really challenging. You know, if we want to get something that actually works, we want to make it something really freaking awesome. So that's really the premise for when we'd actually build an app. Now in 2016, we've reached a new milestone in our company. We dared to dream, and we dreamed of moving to New York City. We opened our second office in Manhattan just earlier this year. And you know, I think that's basically the highlight, I think, of the course that we've taken our company so far, really expanding towards a new country, back to the United States, and really in the hot spot, if you will, of the technical innovation hub of the world, I would like to say. So the success factor, I would really say the success factor of our company can really be appreciated in this single image, in my opinion. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how we got there. Of course, the success of smartphones was critical to our success. When we started in 2009, smartphones were really just becoming popular. We migrated from the old school, clunky, sort of, you know, things like the N95s, clunky smartphones, into something that was really revolutionary with the iPhone. Touch screens that actually worked, apps that were easily downloaded, and with Android even so, and even more so. And when we started, smartphones were fairly unpopular, but if you look at this trend at the moment, you'll see that the trend might be decreasing, but the number of new smartphones onto the market is still something like 200 million year upon year. So that's quite a dramatic increase. And we'll see that the number of mobile phone users are migrating more and more, of course, towards smartphones. So it is even now a growing market, of course. So, and if we look at Android by the numbers, we'll see that of those 2 billion smartphones out there at the moment, 1.4 are actively used Android devices. So that's an enormous majority, and it's an increasing majority still. So we may have reached a threshold of, you know, that Android has become the market leader, but it doesn't take away from the fact that it is still an increasing market. With 200 million devices coming on the market every year. And what we'll actually see is that there is 1.5 million devices being activated every day. That's incredible. So some other numbers here. The number of manufacturers, equipment manufacturers is 400, partnering with Google, of course, and the number of operators, like cellular operators, that sort of thing, 500. Google Play is a similar story. Of those 1.4, 1 billion is on Google Play. China is, of course, a big factor that's being left out of this equation at the moment. The number of app installs is currently 65 billion, and we'll see currently on Google Play roughly 2 million apps. I'll get to that a little. I'll get back to that in a little bit. So how are these users actually using it? So they're, of course, installing their apps through Google Play. But if we look at how users are actually interacting with their Android devices, we'll see that there's been a pretty sharp increase in the number of minutes and hours that users are actually interacting with their phone. So we see over 2012 to 2014 that users are using their phones much longer than they have in the past, and I can attest to that, just sitting in the train or whatever. Everybody's glued to their screens. But what's more interesting than that, in my opinion, is that the number of apps hasn't decreased. So people are still using roughly 27 apps, but the amount of time that they're spending within an app is increasing, which can only really mean one thing, that the user engagement is growing. And what does that really mean, like user engagement? Well, it of course suggests that the quality of apps has somehow gone up. So if we look at apps at the moment, we'll see that the apps, of course, that have the higher ratings are typically apps that, and we can really quantify this in two different ways. So the high ratings, of course, the low ratings, and these numbers are actually from Google. So Google says that 50% of the time that users give your app a 1-star review is because it has something to do with bugginess or poor performance, bad stability. On the other hand, a 5-star review has everything to do with good design, things like the good usability of your application, or that it just feels snappy. And that's over 60% of the 5-star reviews. So I'm kind of more, my own mindset is kind of like a 1-star review is maybe somebody who doesn't understand the app. Well, that's not true. You have to give these people the benefit of the doubt. They're actually more concerned about bugginess and bad stability. So let's focus on the different attributes that makes a quality app, right? So it's obvious, of course, you want some useful features in there, and you really want to identify the features that users are really looking for, so the things that they really love in your application. Of course, beautiful design and how easy it is to use, thinking, of course, about user experience. And of course, for those 5-star reviews, things about good reliability and performance. And something that's frequently actually overlooked is actually using modern features of Android. A recent application in the Netherlands, a travel application for public transit, its score plummeted because it, up until this day, doesn't use runtime permissions, for instance. And users find that very annoying because when they install the application, they see all these permissions that it requires, and they're no longer used to that. They're used to seeing an application that when it needs something, that it'll actually pop up a permission dialog then. And they're also annoyed about, for instance, GPS usage. So this application would be definitely benefited by using things like Google Play services for location tracking. Speaking on the topic of design, of course, and latest features, material design. Let's talk about that for a second. The material design, of course, is very important because it really gives your application something more tangible. Things really pop out in different ways. So really having like rich imagery and bold colors, but also having shadows, for instance, and depth in your application. Motion, animations, that sort of thing. For instance, illustrating how your application navigates or where things go as you move around through the application. It kind of helps the user understand what the intention is of basically the UI of your app. And we'll see that actually over half of the applications on Google Play right now, of those 2 million, 1 million of the apps are already using material design. So if you're, for instance, have a more legacy application and you're more reluctant to changing the design, well, you should bear in mind that you'd be in the minority now, right? So you probably want to reconsider that, and maybe migrate and embrace the material design at this point. There are plenty of developer stories of how material design has really worked for different companies. We'll see companies like Twitter with Fabric, Music Match, we have Wigo and Trello, B&H Photo Video, which sells, of course, physical products. And all of these stories basically come down to the same thing. They see increased engagement of users, less uninstalls, ratings going up, increased retention, so users are staying inside the app longer. And all of these are really attributed through the encouragement of Google. They actually did the metrics on this before and after implementing material design. So if I turn to myself and I look at how did Pixplicity, how did we in our company get good? Like which factors determined that what we were doing got better over time? A lot of what I've been saying so far is like inspirational words, like think of this and think of that. That's all inspiration. But as the saying goes, there's 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. What we like to do is constantly be challenging ourselves. Like I said in the beginning, a lot of the applications that we actually do, clients that we take, projects that we do, are extremely challenging projects and very diversified projects. We do all sorts of different kinds of things. We like to change things up a lot. I find it very important that I encourage my colleagues to kind of push themselves, find new boundaries, and we also actually take those into new fields, new areas that we're not familiar with. Here's a funny animation that project manager took of me. He found it very interesting because he doesn't understand anything about Linux, and he just saw all these console windows and all that. So in this particular example, by the way, I'm developing an application. I'm actually building Android from source as part of an application that is completely configurable. It's used for the Dutch education in elementary schools and basically pushes applications onto the devices in the classroom. And I take this example because we love tinkering on things and we love being on new technologies, and I think this animation just kind of encompasses that mentality. A few examples I want to take throughout. This is one particular project that we actually worked with a piece of hardware. The use case here is that we have a close collaboration with a company in the Netherlands called Deltaris. They do research into water quality throughout the entire world. And in this particular case, they were trying to determine the salinity and pollution of water in developing countries. And they developed this piece of hardware that you see here on the left, which is actually hooked into the microphone port of your Android device. And if you just dip that into water, and you follow a kind of a protocol in doing so, you can determine the salinity of water. And this was actually extremely challenging because every Android device performs differently. So doing a sort of calibration, you know, getting a well-defined algorithm that determines a reliable measurement for the salinity of water, that was a pretty exciting project. Another exciting project that we did that was very technologically challenging was this application we call Romy. Romy basically controls the data usage of other applications. Now, when I first sat down with the acquisition of this client and he told me what his idea was, my instant reaction was to say that's not possible. You can't do that. You can't have one application control what other applications do. But as I was sitting there, I was thinking to myself, wait a second, we have these virtual private networks. If we can host a VPN server on the device, then we can channel all the traffic through it. And ultimately, that's the direction we took it. So you'll see that we have like this whitelist of different applications. And as you're traveling to foreign countries, countries where, for instance, you pay by megabyte, you can limit the connectivity of other apps so that you only use the apps that you find important while you're traveling, say, for chatting or for navigation. One last example is an application that we recently developed for insurance companies in the Netherlands and Belgium. These companies also, by the way, use this particular app as an excellent mechanism of retaining their clients, and I'll get to that as well. This application is called Drive Safely, Keep Focus, and it basically blocks the entire UI of your phone as you're driving. So it detects when the user is in his car and when he's driving, and prohibits him from texting or calling, or basically using anything like Twitter or whatever as he's actually on the road. And one of the ways that insurance companies use this is they'll actually give you a discount on your policy so that you can be encouraged to drive safely. And a lot of the projects that we'll do, and what you'll see probably if you're an agency or as your agency grows, is that a lot of the really cool projects that you do are kind of closed off through NDAs. And that's not unfamiliar, but it sort of sucks because you can't talk about it publicly. A lot of the really exciting things that you do are kind of closed off in the top secret, and you're working for really great big companies. So unfortunately, you can't talk about that, but it's all part of being an agency and doing agency work. So don't shy away from that. Some of the things that we also do, for instance, when I was talking about exploring into new fields, is going into wearables, for instance, doing things like watch faces and wearable apps for large companies. Those are also extremely exciting projects that we can, for instance, be proud of. So let's go back and talk more about the different attributes of making good apps. And for that, we have to understand which kind of app goals. So when you, for instance, sit down with a client, what kind of goals do you want to, what is important for the client, right? These are the kind of things that you have to bring up. Things like loyalty. So how do you make sure that ultimately your user is going to install your app, right? But you want to make sure that your user is actually loyal to using that app. And how do you do that? Well, you can, for instance, think of customer retention, right? Loyalty programs. For instance, if you have an e-commerce app, giving discounts and that sort of thing. Right? How do you engage? Those are also things that we have to think about. Relationships, fostering relationships with your users. Don't look at your users as one whole, but look at each user with his own special interests. An easy way of, for instance, thinking about that is giving, for instance, the user some ability to customize or to filter his own content. It's important to remember, actually, when your user installs your app, he didn't, by coincidence, encounter your app like he would, for instance, on a website. He has gone into your app, he's searched for that app and installed it. So he's looking for specific content, or if he's using an application that uses some sort of services, he's trying to use that service in a practical way. So providing good accessibility to those content and those services is imperative. And of course, related to that, providing good functionality. He wants to get to that functionality as easily and as most practically as possible. So probably what you want to do is either for yourself or for your client is ask key questions. And I've put a couple of examples of what good questions are to ask yourself when you're thinking about what important things there are, what goals there are in your application. Is things like, well, what kind of in-app actions matter most to your user? You know, put together storyboards and look what kind of user behaviors are the most critical, most mission critical for for your client. What does this app actually mean for the client? What is his justification for approaching you as an agency? Actually identifying the value of a user, like a monetary value of a user. For agency, of course, that's very useful because the client is paying you, so he has to find some monetary value for the users that he wants. And of course, ultimately also optimizing the user experience. This is of course mobile. This is an app. So how do you optimize the user experience for these users? And of course, in order to do that, you can measure these things, right? So that everything's about measuring, identifying valuable users. The general rule of thumb, if you look at the average, and these numbers again are by Google. If you look at it, about 17% of your users generate the majority of the revenue, so 85% of the revenue. So you shouldn't be too afraid that not everybody is making revenue for your application, for instance, through in-app purchases or buying physical products. It's not so strange. But what you should do is you should understand how users behave in your application. So you should turn these insights, these things that you measure, into actual marketable actions. So for instance, if you're surprised by the way that people are interacting with your app, that might be an excellent moment to actually refocus and realize that people are using something in a different way than you had expected, and you can then market that, for instance, by actually actually making advertisements saying these are the features. And of course, when you run a campaign like that, of course, you also want to measure the performance of that. What kind of events do you actually want to measure? Well, things like where does the installation come from? So if you have a campaign running, you have, let's say, a campaign running on Facebook, have a campaign running on AdWords, you of course want to figure out which campaign is running best, where that's coming from, and why. Sessions, so the start of a session, end of a session. These are metrics that are important. How users, for instance, engage with notifications. Notifications are a fantastic way to re-engage a stale user. And you want to see if users are actually engaging with that or not, right? Of course, a very important one is figuring out what the actual cause of removal of the app is. So when users are leaving your app, they're uninstalling it, you probably want to figure out the pathway that they took through the app, well, how they were disappointed in some way. And of course, the specific events that actually align or don't align with the goals that you set out in the first place. So if you, for instance, have an e-commerce app, you also want to measure, of course, the selling of products. But before that, you probably also want to figure out when people are looking at, product details, or maybe they had to fill in payment details, and that they got hooked up on that. It was too difficult, and they quit at that moment. So one of the important things, of course, is that first impressions matter, right? We'll see often that users who first install the app will fairly quickly uninstall the app again. It's just the way that it is. Even the most popular apps on Google Play, like if you look at the top 10 apps, drop massively within the first few days of install. So a user that would have first installed the application will be gone. If you look at this measurement, we'll see something like only 60% of the users are still there after 2 months. So that's just the way it is. So don't be too surprised by that. But we can kind of deal with it. We can figure out what the causes are of these drop-off points, so identifying these drop-off points. So when a user gets on board with your application, he will install it. But you're always going to have lapsed users. Maybe he'll have forgotten that he installed it. It's that simple. Maybe he installed it, he didn't really want it, but at some point in the future he realized, oh, what is this app, and he uninstalls it again. It could be for actual tangible reasons that you can do things about. For instance, here in the activation, we'll see if actually logging into your application, or you have a welcome process that is too cumbersome or too not very user-friendly. Logging in, like registering, if you have to register in the app, the user has to fill in his email address. It's very tedious. Maybe that will be a moment where your user lapses and basically leaves. There can be other moments. For instance, maybe one of your goals is that you actually want to have users share somehow, maybe share content, share subscriptions so that other people can get on board. There'll be a moment before that where users can also lapse. And again, also through the actual physical monetization of your app will also be different moments. So identifying those drop-off points and dealing with them is, of course, very important. I'll take a couple of examples of mitigating that. Here, frictionless onboarding. So one of the easy ways of making it easy to actually log into your platform authenticating easily. So here in this application called Doodle, we'll see that we have a classical login right here with a login by email. But of course, the obvious thing to do is also allow users to log in through Facebook or Google or Twitter or something like that. So it's a one-click login. Payments, very similar. If you want to, for instance, facilitate payments of physical products, you can use Google Play Wallet, or you can use Google Play itself. You can use Google Wallet. You can also hook into existing SDKs like PayPal. Engaging through notifications. I mentioned this a little bit briefly earlier on, but to really re-engage with users and keep them constantly focused on using your app again, a great way of doing that is actually offering richer notifications. In a rich notification, you can actually provide actions, right? So you can allow a user to interact and somehow interacting with that notification bring you deep into the application where that content is actually relevant. Other things to consider is actually stacking similar notifications because you don't want to spam the user, of course. And again, that same topic of don't treat all your users the same, right? So make sure that these notifications that they're receiving is relevant to their interests. So not a very generic notification like this and that product is on sale, but only that this and that product is on sale if that's something that the user would probably be interested in. I have a couple of slides about user retention. I'll just kind of go through them fairly quickly. There are a couple of different topics, something like e-commerce. I've put this in different ways. I've said, OK, so this is something that we want to measure on the short term. This is something that we can actually, this is something actionable, something that we can stimulate. And this is something that we can measure as a result of that as a measurement on the long term. So for instance, for e-commerce, of course, you can measure searches and how that ultimately computes into users purchasing a product. Then if you want to improve that, you can do things like rewards or loyalty programs, offering coupons or offering points. Like you can collect points and you can use those points later on. And on the long term, you can actually then compare how that over time has generated better revenue or that the revenue per user has increased. Let's talk about service industry. Here's a particular example from Pocket Agent. This is an insurance company. Accessing the services or actually using things like looking at your policy or filing claims or that sort of thing is something that you can measure, of course, on the short term. And you're trying to stimulate as your goal might be to actually generate more revenue as a customer, not necessarily in the application, but for the insurance company as a customer to upgrade or buy additional services. And again, the long term would then be increased revenue. Digital services, excellent example would be Hulu, video streaming. So how do you actually access and engage with media? So how are they watching videos and that sort of thing? And probably what you would want to stimulate is sharing content. So maybe you have an existing customer and you want that customer to get other people, friends and that sort of thing on board. And the way you want to do that is give them a good experience, right? Give them relevant content, things that relate to their interests. And on the long term, then you can actually measure that through referral subscriptions. So I mentioned a lot about measurement. How do you actually do measurement? Well, there's some great powerful tools for that. Currently, the most powerful tool for doing that is Firebase Analytics, which provides a ton of different things. Firebase in its whole provides a fantastic set of resources. Firebase Analytics in particular is fantastic for actually hooking into existing ad networks. And a more historical solution that we have actually used very frequently in the past is just Google Analytics for apps. So those are some fantastic tools that you can actually use to perform these measurements. And actually, of course, testing your application, in the interest of reducing bugs, increasing stability. Google can also help you with that. Google Play can help you with that through testing on multiple devices using, for instance, the Google Cloud Test Lab. And on Google Play itself, you can use open and closed beta programs. And the lovely thing about that actually is that if you offer a test program, what you can do is you can, when users fill in reviews or fill in ratings, and maybe your application isn't super stable at that point, it doesn't affect your public store listing. So it's basically just beta feedback. So for instance, if your app is crashing and a user has a bad time and he wants to give you a 1-star review, that's beta feedback. So it doesn't count against your store listing. So you can react to that, of course, fix those bugs, release a new version, and then finally when the user does want to give a good rating, because that crash is then gone, that does account to your store rating. So that's fantastic. And of course, speaking on testing very generically, which is a topic in itself, continuous integration, think of that sort of thing to actually perform tests before it goes live, and general QA, of course. There are a couple of ways to actually stand out. So when you're sitting with your client, you probably want to provide him a couple of suggestions on how he can make his app stand out from the 2 million applications that are on Google Play. A couple of ways of doing that is carefully considering how you present your store listing. Actually, you know, making things, well, you have, of course, the store listing itself, the description, the icon, the images. You can put a nice video in there. You can put screenshots. The way that you do that should really be something that interests the user, something that is really unique and jumps out. Not having a wall of text, you know, really showcasing the useful features, making good use, of course, of video so the user can actually watch what the intention of your application before he installs it. And what works best, maybe you don't know. A great way of figuring that out is actually doing experiments with A/B testing. The A/B testing on Google Play will actually allow you to completely customize the store listing and do metrics, so you actually compare how that results in more installations for one test over another. And actually reaching your demographic, of course, a great way of doing that is doing ad campaigns on ad networks that use demographics. Things like AdWords or Facebook ads and even promoted tweets. You can really customize to a particular demographic how that ad is presented. And of course, measuring that. Maybe your client is interested to know how we can actually monetize your application. Now, I know there are, of the 190 countries that are supporting Google Play, 130 support payments. Somebody told me it's not supported in Georgia. Is that true? Well, yeah, that sort of sucks, I guess. But you can sort of mitigate that because, for instance, what you can do instead, in countries that aren't supported through in-app purchases, you can hook into, for instance, Google, something like an SDK like PayPal that will facilitate payments. And we've done that in the past. Applications that we wanted to launch into China, for instance, we provided users there local payment options so they could still perform an in-app purchase for a digital product inside the application. Even though that they didn't have access to Google Play's in-app purchase. If you could use Google Play purchases, something to bear in mind is subscriptions. Subscriptions are a fantastic way, of course, for a client to get recurring revenue. And at the moment, it is absolutely the fastest growing model. We've seen that this has been growing massively over the past few years. And one way of actually billing users for that is directly through their carrier, which makes it extremely low barrier for them. They don't actually have to fill in credit card information or any payment information. It just goes straight off of their phone bill. Also consider that maybe you don't want to monetize, right? 90% of users are only interested in installing free apps. So for instance, if your app is paid right off the get-go, you actually have to pay to install your application, which is, by the way, only 1% of the applications on Google Play at the moment, and shrinking. Users don't want that. So really quantify what the value is of your customer and what he's probably looking for to figure out how you can strike a balance between what the user's wishes are and how you're going to find a way of monetizing that. And there are some key questions that you can ask, things like, does this app increase the customer loyalty? Maybe there's no reason to monetize at all because solely through brand loyalty, your client might actually garner more clientele just through the user's loyalty of using the application, being aware, being constantly reminded of this brand. Something that we'll see often is that a client, a very large client, a multinational company will actually be wanting to display ads in their app. Well, why? I mean, the amount of revenue generated through that is peanuts, right? Does that match the mission statement of the company? The client should really look at himself and consider whether displaying ads is part of his mission statement. I want to take a little sidetrack. The way that we actually took all of these factors in our own company, we have one product that we actually run within Pixplicity, which is an audio tour app. And if you ever go to Amsterdam, they have a canal boat tour, and it's a fantastic canal boat tour. And actually use this platform to do so. And the amazing thing that they actually accomplished with this is that the client, he was able to get his traditional offline audio, audio tour boxes that you would just wear around your neck onto a smartphone that users could, tourists could install just over the Wi-Fi in the boats, just in 24 hours. So in this content management system, they just filled in all of their audio, all their points, and they could hook straight into the app and get a customized white label version of their application on the market. Right, so one thing I wanted to bring up about kind of in closing is things that we find important in Tbilisi is also engaging with community. We do so in different ways. Directly engaging with developers, of course, through open source. We have a ton of different content that we actually provide on public repositories and other ways. Actually sharing knowledge, sharing things that we do, attending events and also even organizing events. And I have a couple of examples of that. Here's some open source content that we actually provide. And this is a great way of showcasing your agency's knowledge, right? If you're, of course, extremely proud of the knowledge, the technical know-how that you have in your company. You want to publicize that. You want people to know and you want people to see what you're capable of. And a fantastic way of doing that is through having public code libraries. You yourself as a developer probably use a ton of libraries that are open source. Return back into the community, and people will also see that you generate a lot of fantastic things. Other things that we do, we have a YouTube channel, so we also showcase our knowledge in that way. We really show to, people are looking for content, like maybe explanations of how to use Bluetooth Low Energy or Android Wear, that sort of thing. And we'll have a YouTube series about that. One of our engineers will sit down in front of the camera, sometimes more nervous than other times. It's not an easy thing to do. And they'll actually show with some code how they approach a particular topic, and they'll kind of keep it generic. And that's a fantastic way of showcasing your knowledge as well. Other things that we do is actually going to events. This is a particular slide from Ankara, and I know that Georgie, where is Georgie? He's there. Is that him? That's him, I think. Is that him? Yeah, I think so. Actually going to events, speaking at events, but also learning from events. Just through your presence, networking with others, being part of a community, I think, is invaluable for multiple reasons. Finding other developers with shared interests. Maybe you're looking to hire. Maybe you are looking to learn. Maybe you want to share that knowledge, and that people look at your company and see that that technical skill level. I put this slide in there because I also think it's ultimately very important that you also just enjoy your time working at a company. We do a ton of fun things at the office just to keep our employees happy. We do lots of different activities. We just love our work. And with that, I just wanted to close with an inspirational remark. So if you have any questions about me about specific projects that we do, just catch me in the break between sessions. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for listening.